Okay. Mobility, transportation. We were talking about development and kind of like longer historical phases, and we're kind of moving up. Industrial Revolution, um, industrial manufacturing, right? This was a big leap in many ways as far as productivity and how much stuff could be made per person. A big part of the Industrial Revolution was transportation because, well, being able to get all of your stuff to factories and to get things from factories to where people are. um, so during the colonial era, a lot of the colonial countries would say that they were helping the countries that they were in, they're helping them develop, right? And there is this kind of narrative of vague inefficiencies that different countries had, and that European powers would help them. But the infrastructure that usually those European powers would put in would all be just to get resources out of the country, and they really wouldn't be put in a way that would help local development efforts, wouldn't help local markets, or local people find a better job, things like that. And then when colonialization ended, that's infrastructure that was still in place. In many places, it still is. Just a colonial map. Some examples from the book, looking at, well, Australia, obviously, was a colony of Britain. You could see that, well, these rail lines aren't so much to connect places within the country as much as just to extract resources. And pre-colonial empires, which I think it could be argued that these were also, any empire is colonial really, because part of the definition of an empire is it takes over new space and then it imposes its will on the new spaces that it takes over. But this is, of course, pre-Columbian connection. But the Incan Empire, their roads were said to have been better than Rome's, and Rome's roads were what was used as one of the definitions of how advanced Roman society was at their time. These transportation systems, depending on the climate, they can degrade quite fast. We know that firsthand from, we had a highway collapse, right? That was in need of maintenance 35W a number of years back. And that has actually been an increasing thing in the US, trying to invest in infrastructure. Most countries around the world, they keep up their roads and their transportation through taxes on things like oil. But the United States has a very strict no taxes, low cost of oil policy. So they need to find other places for that tax money, and in general, no one wants to raise taxes, right? It's always a political year. Just some more examples of railroad networks from colonial times. Again, Argentina. In South Africa, the roads were built in ways that actually went around the local indigenous African populations and only connected the white areas. Let's see, I already talked about some problems with infrastructure in the U.S. While the U.S. has its infrastructure in mixed condition, lots of countries around the world are expanding and upgrading their transit system. I don't know if y'all have traveled much, but if you do, you'll probably notice that like the rail transit is quick and easy in quite a few other places compared to here, and well kept up, clean, all that kind of thing. We have, especially here in Minnesota, we have some light rail. which is it's relatively new, so it hasn't really downgraded yet. Um, let's see. The book also talks about specifics in Nicaragua, and this is actually happens in through lots of Latin America. But gated cities, gated communities, which you might have heard of or seen, uh, they're a real big thing in Latin America, and very often through time the roads and infrastructure are built in a way that you need to have a car to be able to go to places um, that are important. Uh, I think I don't remember, but I probably mentioned the example of Brasilia in Brazil, which was meant to be the new capital of Brazil, and it was designed in an ultra modern way. It didn't include sidewalks, but most of the population couldn't afford cars, so it then ended up having the highest rate of uh, vehicle and pedestrian fatalities because people are walking along on the roads because that's where you can walk. Just some pictures of the book of various successes and failures of infrastructure. Um, a thing that we do experience here quite a bit is also just the maintenance of roads. Here in Minnesota, because we have such temperature extremes, it really is hard on the roads. And I've seen this week that they've really opened up, as we call it locally, road construction season. Uh, Especially over here in St. Paul, half the roads are blocked off. But what else are you gonna do? Some have suggested that European models of roads, they tend to invest more money in the roads uh, rather than just kind of like thinly fixing potholes and whatnot. They make roads that are meant to last. But I would say also they don't have the temperature extremes that we have. And so with less temperature extremes, you have less, the freezing and thawing cycles that happen. And every time you have a freezing and thawing cycle, a little bit of water seeps into cracks, and then when it freezes, it expands, and then that process happens again and again. On top of that, here, of course, we also have road salt that gets in these cracks and can expand and contract and reliquefy depending on kind of what's going on with the roads. Um, so as I say, these things need near constant maintenance. I would say the only other places that would need as much maintenance or more are tropical locations, just because they don't have the freezing cycles, of course, but they have so much rain. Um, So diffusion of the Industrial Revolution. Diffusion of the Industrial Revolution. You can see that there are some places that, it caught on quick, passed around relatively quickly. Many countries and many places try to kind of keep it something of a secret, the different processes, especially if they had sometimes things that were new increases of productivity. But in reality, people who work in industry would tend to socialize and meet each other, and you would maybe quit a job one place and get a job another place. And if you noticed an improvement that your previous job had, that your new job could have, you might suggest it. The only places that took kind of a long time to industrialize were often places that were colonial. And so in India, for example, the British would specifically destroy any kind of industry that people were trying to put together because Britain wanted markets for its manufactured goods and didn't want competition, right? Because as soon as places were able to compete, they did, and often made products that were just as good, often less expensive. Within the U.S., we have a number of different industrial regions, major industrial regions. You can see that we are on the map a bit. Well, this was during the heyday of not just automobile, but manufacturing in general in the U.S. There used to be a lot more Used to be a lot more manufacturing locally. And there's still a lot of manufacturing worldwide, but typically not as much in the U.S. Similar thing has happened in Europe with deindustrialization, meaning that you tend to have lots of empty industrial space, and we have a fair amount. We weren't that much of a manufacturing base compared to lots of other places in Europe or the U.S. When I say we, I say Minnesota. We had more of a mixed economy, which means that we were less hard hit when deindustrialization did happen. It's not a year, it doesn't have a year. All right. Export processing zones, I believe I talked about those before in a couple different regions. Export processing zones tend to be places that governments will open up in their countries where they'll usually the main thing to get companies to locate there is they'll offer breaks on local taxes. In China specifically, they would put up a whole bunch of infrastructure in the hopes that having the decrease costs of not having to put in your own infrastructure would have a lot of manufacturers locate there, and a lot of manufacturers did locate there. Some other places that had export processing zones, Central America, for example, they didn't put in a lot of infrastructure or anything like that. They basically just gave tax breaks, and very often the companies that would kind of come and go in those areas were less reliable. They weren't really, for example, if a company is going to come into China, into one of their export processing zones, there's still a fair amount of red tape, and they need to answer questions about their employment and what kind of policies they're going to have. In other areas around the world, much less rules. Well, in the videos we saw might be some fair examples. Those are international products that were being mined and whatnot by very large companies that are making the profits off of it. But on the ground, people who are doing the hard work, there's no oversight if you have 4-year-old employees working 12-hour days. In the U.S., a number of places were hit by deindustrialization. Detroit's the one that's always kind of pointed out as a big example. Michigan itself was a huge center of automobile manufacturing, and so when imports started becoming higher quality and cheaper, it took a chunk out of the market. Detroit, having been kind of the center of Michigan's economy and the U.S.'s economy when it comes to automobile manufacturing, was very hard hit. This northern area here referred to as the Rust Belt these days, and you can see it does include a little bit of us there. The Rust Belt, where manufacturing used to be. And lots of places have been able to rebuild in their old industrial areas. Some of that has happened in Minnesota, some of the areas down by the riverfront that used to just be manufacturing, just places where ships would just take cargo and stuff. They've changed it to condos. Sometimes they make them, in Europe, they make them into kind of like entertainment districts, and they very much have turned their rivers into kind of like scenic areas for tourists, which it's a smart strategy, but it's expensive. Redevelopment of industrial areas like that in the U.S. has been very piecemeal, very slow, but also in general we have less kind of government coordination of these types of efforts. There's more of an emphasis in the U.S. of just letting the market take care of problems, which often means that the problems don't get taken care of, right? Another picture from Detroit. Having lost a quarter of its population just between 2000 and 2010, and that wasn't the height of the deindustrialization. things that they're doing in Detroit, they're trying a number of different things, such as increasing urban farms. And this is, you could do this on residential land. It's difficult to do on land that used to be industrial because you have all kinds of chemicals and whatnot that no one really knows what's in the soils. There's a process you can do to clean soils, but it's expensive. It involves kind of like taking the soil and putting it in a processor and kind of cooking it until you cook off the various chemicals and things that you don't want. Very expensive process. This is another picture from the book, just an example of waterfront redevelopment that happens in lots of places that have kind of gone through the deindustrialization cycle. An emphasis on new construction often is on more green space for lots of different reasons. In our next chapter, we'll talk about urban heat islands, and that helps dissipate urban heat a bit. It also helps with things like just water management. You know, when it rains, if it's all pavement, it all has to run off, and you need infrastructure for where all that water is going to go. But if you have a fair amount of like soil, you know, that will absorb the water and then kind of slowly release it through time, so you don't have as much of a flooding issues. Post-development. Well, post-development is a very specific argument looking at aid from rich countries to poor countries. And basically seeing if it's with strings attached, if it's for specific political purposes, or if it is in fact to help out the different countries. And it really depends. It really depends. There's a giant market for used clothing. You know, if you've ever donated used clothing and wondered where it goes, very often it kind of depends. If there's a place that has an immediate need, it makes a lot of sense. A lot of the clothes, well, it can send people out of business who make clothes in those countries themselves, right? If you have clothes coming in that are near free. So it's one of those difficult things where people want to help out and be generous, but at the same time, things that we're bringing into these different markets, it's like, well, if they put local producers of things out of business, are they helping? Are they not? If you don't have local producers at all, if there's been some type of national catastrophe, then that makes more sense. Same with food imports to places. Obviously, it's good to keep the price of food low. Sometimes food imports can run local producers out of business. If there's some calamity that has happened, so if there's no production happening, well, then it makes sense, because then you're not putting anybody out of business because everyone's already out of business. There's different aid strategies that have been in vogue through time. So for example, there was a time period where the big emphasis was on the construction of dams and dam development for a number of reasons, for hydroelectric power and just for having a stable source of water, because you build up a big reservoir behind your dam for any kind of water you want to use. But after a while, a number of these dams were being put in places that they didn't have something to use that hydroelectric power for, and also sometimes they would contract out to other countries for the construction and the maintenance of the dam, and so then if they didn't pay people from other countries to maintain the dam, it would fall into disrepair, because you would have to teach locals how to take care of it, and that would often involve a whole different thing of specific engineering degrees and whatnot. And so after a number of these different projects just kind of fell into disrepair and were not used, well, as you can see, there's a big decline in push for dams as a solution to everything. if you're looking at development assistance, where it's coming from and where it's going to, you could see on this map it's a high correlation with a number of different war zones or places that are high at need, and that of course makes sense. If the productive capacity of a place has been destroyed, they need all the different types of assistance that can be given out. The other thing through time that has been happening is a lot of countries are been trying to have some mutual aid among the other poorer countries rather than relying on developed countries for everything, right? Especially if the cooperation from more developed countries usually comes with political requirements of various kinds. In development circles, there has been a renewed effort to try to, instead of going into a country and basically telling them what they need and then providing the things that you've determined they need, of asking locals about like what do they do in their day-to-day lives and looking at what things can be labor saving and locally managed development projects and efforts. And this, it sounds like an obvious thing, but it was really only in the past like 20 years that this has been put together as a development strategy to actually ask people on the ground what their needs are or aren't. In this example here, there was a lot of time was being spent getting water and bringing water back to the home, but a lot of that time, it wasn't really calculated even by the kind of elders of the village because it was work that women were doing, right? And so it didn't register with them as this kind of colossal use of time that if they would have spent some effort digging more wells and having more access rather than having miles and miles of walking to get water and then bringing it back and forth. Things like that, and taking into account the local stakeholders in development. That's kind of like the local new in vogue thing. The other thing that has been changing a lot is, we are looking a lot at core and periphery in countries that are more developed or less developed. And that map is changing up because you have what are often called islands of development kind of all over the place, and very often in areas that were more widely considered as developing. They have different areas that have developed, and so that allows for more of countries connecting to each other and not having to go through like the top tier of the main developed countries in the world for their expertise, for their assistance, for their knowledge. There's a number of different ways that people hope that new technologies will really help out, well, as it says, the global south, places that are less developed. The examples from the book: low-cost rugged laptops, low-cost fuel-efficient cars, apps that provide current market prices for crops. I would say that is one that has been working and very popular. Apps that diagnose ailments remotely. That's probably, my guess would be, obviously that our textbook was published before COVID, but I would imagine that has probably found people to do that. And again, the hope is that with global communication technology, people will be able to problem solve more independently on their own. And again, the hope is that less developed countries will develop the products because they know what less developed countries need. And so rather than, again, like I said, having a more developed economy decide what another country needs and providing that, while other low-income countries Now this example of $3,700 nano lightweight car. The other very more recent focus on development has been focused on differences between men and women. Women in many countries aren't allowed to run business. Sometimes they're not allowed to even interact in a public market. As I've traveled the world and gone to plenty of markets, it's always a bit weird, but there are plenty that you'll go to, and it's like there's not a single woman outside of maybe a tourist here or there. And then there's the concept of I think it's called the double day, where women around the world will be often they'll work a full day, but then they'll still be expected to be the ones who will take care of the children, take care of the elderly, take care of the unpaid things in the home. This chapter talks about a lot of different possible solutions to a number of problems. One that has been very in vogue is microfinance. Microfinance is what it sounds like. In poorer countries, it's been very difficult for people to access small amounts of money to start up their own businesses. And very often, like I said, these are not large amounts of money, average loan of $100. But again, it's just people who have no access to credit, So these are small amounts, and they have a very high payback rate. I visited a factory in India that had been refinanced with microfinance. So what it is it's a paper company. It's a paper company. They make special kind of fancy paper. And what they do is, I showed you on our other slide about how there's kind of like a plethora of shirts and clothes that are being distributed and given away to different countries for free. Well, what they do is they take a bunch of them that have degraded and that people don't want to buy, that are mostly cotton, and that's what these sacks are full of, old shirts that have been kind of pulled apart, and that's what they do here. They take these old shirts and they pull them apart and get them down to kind of like their basic cotton particles. And this was a project that was about 20 women who all got microfinance loans, and they were, they pooled their resources. And as I said before, India is kind of catching up and industrializing. It's a bit behind China, for example, when it comes to industrializing and making factories and whatnot. But as I said, they pooled their resources and their microloans together. And it's not the most high-tech of equipment, obviously, but they're all working and they're making paper. When they get the cotton and they get it all kind of processed and pulled apart, they then basically squish out the liquid and dry them out. This is just some of the deities that I often see hanging around when I was in India. And the end product are kind of fancy paper for presents and things like that. And these are shipped around the world, and so like you could be at a little store like Patina or something and looking at gift cards, and if you see that one has come from India, it could have been this company. So that's an example of microfinance. This chapter, again, talking about aid and money and charities. It talked a little bit about celebrities and whether or not celebrities are really aiding in different causes that they go for. It really depends. Oh, also, it labeled, this is not Angelina Jolie, but when they got this, they labeled it as Angelina Jolie, so I thought I would just leave that up there, though I think that's Madonna. Um, well, the book talks about how celebrity has been used in good ways in the past. Charlie Chaplin was one of the first to mock Hitler in a movie that helped, um, well, people see that Hitler was not a good guy, and this is before we were at war with him. And the book also used the example of Jane Fonda, who was an anti-war activist. I would say plenty of conservatives would not like her used as an example because they didn't like that she was anti-war during the Vietnam War. And then Johnny Cash also brought attention to a lot of problems in the U.S. prison system. The U.S. prison system still has problems, obviously, but it used to have a lot more. There used to be elaborate chain gang systems that were basically slavery, lots of different things like that. So, but as I said, the book was asking if different celebrity efforts are really helpful or not. At least they could publicize things. The other thing those videos that we looked at showed were when it comes to development, there are kind of like prices to pay sometimes. This is, I got a picture, see what this is? Largest human-made excavation in the world is right here in the U.S., Salt Lake City. So when it comes to development and all the different problems of not being sustainable, have had through time, things that we've talked about like slash and burn agriculture, right? Not being sustainable. Well, there's been a changeover, and again, this is extremely recent. That there's been emphasis on sustainability that people are trying to look at with kind of mixed success. Early developments in the U.S. And in Europe largely cut down one of the biggest resources that we had. Much of the rest of the world is going through a similar process now. I think I've talked before a few different times about how in Brazil, really depends on the political regime. The current president is in favor of deforesting, and basically what he would like to do is kind of like make a whole bunch of suburbs out of the rainforest. The president who was in power before him was a socialist who was doing the opposite. And so it really depends on the political winds of the time and who gets elected. One of the reasons that places are actually kind of starting to listen a little bit to sustainability and looking out for biodiversity is often just because they're tourist hotspots and can make money on tourism. And tourism, I mean, before COVID hit, tourism was a huge and growing industry worldwide. And as I said, a lot of people started looking at their environments as places where tourists would want to go, so that would be a reason to keep them clean and whatnot. Since the pandemic started, tourism worldwide has been way, way low. Last summer, I actually went to France and Portugal right after they reopened, which was a bit of a crazy experience. They had a much more strict shutdown over in place. And so, for example, in Paris, people I talked to who lived in the city, if they left their front door to take the dog on a walk, they could have police stop them and ask them if it was very necessary for them to be walking around. And they had very strong lockdown for a large amount of time. because a lot of these cities, the populations are so densely together that a highly transmissible disease can just spread like wildfire. So they clamp down extra hard. Well, when I went, as I said, they had reopened, and I went to Portugal a month after France, and Portugal had more fully reopened and was allowing tourists then. Uh, if you feel like being a tourist somewhere, I'm gonna attempt to go places again this summer. I would say go to a place that is known for being overrun with tourists because you'll get it in a way that it will never be again, which is without tourists. Um, when I went to Versailles in France, usually I've been there before, and like the palace is usually just packed with people, and it's like sardines, and you can't get around anywhere, and you can't get any good pictures of anything because people are standing everywhere. I went and I was the only one who would be in these rooms, would have the whole place to myself. So that's my little encouragement if you want to do some travel. This chapter also talks about the byproducts of industrialization, the byproducts of development. Again, a lot of saying, well, what are the downsides? Especially burning more rainforest. Well, we're releasing more carbon dioxide into the air. Surface temperatures are going up. You've heard all this before at some point. Melting glaciers, rising sea levels. These are all things that are not considered sustainable, but again, these are things that we'll see if we do anything about any of these things in our age of COVID. When it comes to alternative energies, I've showed you some different things here and there. I would say in my trips, the things that I see most easily are wind power, just because they're so easy to see on the landscape, but I do see those with increasing frequency. This map here is actually an old study done in 2015 by Germany when they were looking at, as you may know, Germany and much of Europe really relies on Russia for natural gas and fossil fuel energy. And they've been looking at alternatives for a long time. And a number of countries, the alternative they've picked is nuclear power, like France gets most of its power from nuclear energy. A number of other countries do. Germany does that a lot too, but also sees that as not as ideally sustainable. Germany, though being quite far north, has a surprising amount of solar industry, mostly because it gets lots of tax breaks and stuff. And they have like an amount of sun. It's not like it's as cold there as it is here in the winter. Well, this map, as I was saying, is from a project where Germany was looking at, hypothetically, how much of an area, if it was completely covered in solar power, how much space would it take up to power all of Germany? And all of Germany would be this amount. Now, of course, this is an area that isn't the most politically stable these days. But this is also an area that has very low populations, because it's, well, outside of a couple oases here and there, it's unpopulated desert, right? The Sahara Desert. They also, in the calculations, to provide all the power for the entire European Union would take this much land for solar. And then for the entire world's needs is this much, right? So if eventually there is perhaps more political stability, the thing with solar power is it's interesting because you could graph, and people do graph, the decreasing costs of solar power. And the point that the depletion costs hit the price of other fuels, the fossil fuels that we have, and become less expensive is during the 2020s. It's supposed to be when that would happen. So we'll see. But what that would mean to something like power and industry, it would mean, again, most of what we're talking about when we say the global south, well, those are places that get a lot of sun, mostly. And so that could be a revolution for a lot of things in a lot of places. But again, I know that's getting out there a bit. It's kind of funny, I've used an older edition of the same textbook for teaching the same class like 10 years ago, and they had 2 extra chapters at the end, and one was geography of the future, which they just cut out. So I'm just throwing in some future stuff anyway. So air quality, another problem that's been happening, and sometimes things are done. So China became pretty notorious for its pollution. A lot of places, when their goal is economic development, and if they feel like they're coming from behind and they want to catch up with more developed places, they'll often not have strong environmental laws and rules. China did actually increase a lot of their environmental rules leading up to the 2008 Olympics because it knew that the world was viewing them. But it just did that in Beijing, where the Olympics were had, and of course China is a great big country with lots of most of its manufacturing is actually not in the Beijing area. But they did things like, I don't know if anyone's ever been to China, but they sell coal on these little round briquette things, and people commonly use coal for heating their house and for cooking, which is a perfectly good thing to cook with. But coal has certain, I guess you would call them impurities, things that are not just the coal. It's kind of like whatever else was around at the time that the coal formed. Coal formed something like 250 million years ago, most of it, when the Earth kind of had this great big swampy area. And so it's this old organic material. That's what coal is. And the different grades of coal change place by place, and it's kind of just a random mixture of the components that were there when that coal formed 250 million years ago. And so some places, like where the Industrial Revolution started in the UK, they have tons of coal. That's part of the reason why the Industrial Revolution started there. And it's high grade coal. Like, it's still polluting and made the air dirty, but not as bad as other places. Unfortunately, China and India, although they both have tons of coal, and so that's good, there's plenty of places that don't have any fossil fuels, and they've had real trouble developing. They have tons of coal, but it is coal with a lot of impurities. So anytime you burn it, whatever else is in there goes into the atmosphere. And the process it would take of processing the coal and taking out the impurities would cost so much that it wouldn't be a usable source of energy anymore. They talk about, sometimes you hear people talking about clean coal technology. Usually that is in places that have coal that is actually not that dirty. It's higher grade coal, and so it actually doesn't take as much to kind of make it a bit cleaner. But the rest of the world, they would have to have a leap in technology to be able to switch up. But they're not likely to change anytime soon because, like I said, China and India both have a ton of coal. As I said, lots of places don't. Like, most of Africa doesn't have coal. They're more likely to have other fossil fuels. The maps of these resources is just like random, right? Smog in LA. This is another picture from the book. Again, talking about the downside of development and industrialization. Ozone, I don't remember if I talked about this in much detail before. Ozone, you guys know what ozone is? Kind of, sort of. So ozone is just 3 oxygen atoms that are just connected because they tend to be grabby and they connect. And we breathe oxygen, right? We breathe O2, which is 2. If we try to breathe O3, which comes out of our tailpipes, so we breathe more than 0 of it in, just day by day, your lungs just were not designed for O3, and it can cause a lot of damage. A lot of places, especially California, have really increased their environmental rules through time, but that has involved increase of taxes because it costs money. And actually, California has had a lot of economic pressure from companies saying that they're going to leave, and individuals saying they're going to leave because the taxes are too high for things like this. It's ironic that we make ozone, on the ground because we are also creating a hole in our ozone shield. One of the industrial chemicals that was revolutionary in making electronics was chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs. And CFCs, the O3, CFCs just break those apart. And so we've been making chlorofluorocarbons for long enough that they're kind of like everywhere. And when they got up into the upper atmosphere, which is where a lot of our ozone naturally occurs, the ozone in the other upper atmosphere block interstellar radiation from the Earth's surface. And so, we did a couple holes in the ozone shield developed, especially around the north and south poles. And so places like Australia, this ozone hole in the ozone shield would be more directly over them during periods of the year, and their rates of skin cancer just like skyrocketed. And so, like I said, it's ironic because we make a bunch of ozone, we just make it in the wrong place because it's actually desperately needed, but at the top of our atmosphere. Again, talking about sustainability, this chapter talks about a number of different places that are being inundated by rising waters, right? Some evacuated, especially some that are in the Pacific. A number of the islands are just inches above sea level, so it doesn't take long for them to be inundated. Mountaintop mining, well, this is a way that we get a lot of coal in the U.S. And the process of what we do, if you could picture the Appalachian Mountains, they'll find a coal seam, right? Coal is in these different seams, and they'll find a coal seam that's like at the top of a mountain, and they'll explode dynamite the entire top of the mountain so they could get that entire seam of coal and just kind of scrape it off. And what what this does is when you blow up the top of the mountain, right? Well, obviously the whole ecosystem that exists at the top of that mountain is no longer there. But then all the material and debris is washed off into the streams that go around these mountains. And so it fills those up with debris. And so things like that, although coal is what we use to generate most of the electricity in the United States, it's coal. But the prices that we pay, and the book talks a bit about fracking as well. I feel like fracking is kind of like a lot to go in on for a lecture because it has so much stuff to be talked about. But I will post a link to a good little video on our class website that you could watch if you're interested in looking at. Let's see, cultural landscapes. Again, sticking on industry. and the new geographies of industry. Things like Amazon fulfillment centers, right, are starting to become the center of a lot of our industry in the U.S. I would say, this book obviously was published before COVID, but if anything, a lot of these, the directions of the economy, of people shopping online, of people not going to places to shop, and so those places being unable to pay their bills and going under, where we had a deindustrialization where industry went away and then we had all this kind of empty space that was often just kind of left to rot. The book looks at increasingly malls, right? Increasingly malls are being abandoned and malls are being going out of business. And the question is what to do with a lot of them. From an urban planning perspective, one of the kind of in vogue things seems to be these days is to, if you have an old mall that's not doing so well, you build housing right next connected to it, so that basically you have the people who live there might do an amount of shopping or interacting in that mall, but that way all the infrastructure that's been put in place wouldn't be to waste, because a lot of these older malls especially were put in with so much parking. They just have these, it's like deserts of parking lots surrounded them, especially if they've gone defunct, if they've gone out of business. That's kind of the new shapes of geography of consuming, buying and selling stuff. All right. Well, that is all I got for this chapter. So I'm gonna let you go just a few minutes, really. And have a good weekend. It's supposed to be warm today.